August 15, 1945, 12:00 noon, Tokyo time. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through a static-filled radio. The first time in 2,600 years of Japanese history that a living god spoke directly to his people. The message was simple. Japan had surrendered. World War II was over. 6.9 million Japanese soldiers scattered across Asia heard those words. 2.1 million of them would become prisoners of war. And among them 37 female military nurses stationed in the Philippines were about to discover something that would destroy everything they believed. Not torture, not execution. Soap, 1 bar per week. Hot water 16 hours a day. Clean towels. Shampoo. The United States military would spend more on hygiene supplies for Japanese prisoners in 1 month than the entire Japanese army spent feeding American prisoners for 3 years. This is the story of Machiko Hayashi, a 26-year-old nurse, honor graduate from Tokyo Women's Medical Institute, a woman who kept a knife hidden in her sleeve for 3 years ready to kill herself rather than face American captivity. She never used that knife. Instead, she stood under hot water in a Texas bathroom and wept until her legs gave out. Not from pain, from confusion, because everything she knew was a lie. The radio went silent. Machiko stood frozen. Her fingers gripped the edge of the operating table so hard her knuckles turned white. Beside her, Captain Yuko Shimizu's surgical instruments clattered to the floor. The sound of metal striking tile echoed like gunfire. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Hanako Mori, 19 years old. 3 months in the Philippines, dropped to her knees. Her hands clutched her uniform hem, as if the fabric could anchor her to a world that was dissolving. "This cannot be real," Hanako whispered. "The divine wind was supposed to save us. The gods were supposed to protect the emperor." Captain Shimizu's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Stand up, and all of you, now." The nurses snapped to attention. Shimizu walked slowly between the rows, her boots clicking against the floor. Her face showed nothing. But Machiko saw her hands. They were shaking. "We are soldiers of the emperor," Shimizu said. "We do not collapse. We do not weep. We do not show weakness to anyone, especially not to the Americans who will come for us." "What will they do to us?" Keiko Tanaka asked. Her voice cracked on the last word. Shimizu stopped walking. She turned to face the window, her back to the nurses. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "You know what they will do. Tokyo radio has told us. Every wounded soldier has told us. The Americans are animals. They will use us. They will break us. And then they will kill us." Machiko's hand moved instinctively to her sleeve. The knife was still there, cold metal against warm skin. She had practiced the motion 1,000 times. One quick slash across the wrist. It would be over in minutes, If capture becomes inevitable, Shimizu continued, you know what is expected. Die with honor. Do not give them the satisfaction of taking you alive. 7 days passed. 7 days of waiting. 7 days of jumping at every distant engine sound. 7 days of Machiko lying awake at night practicing the knife motion under her blanket. On August 22nd, the Americans arrived. Machiko watched from a second-floor window as jeeps rolled through the hospital gates. American soldiers jumped out. Their uniforms were spotless. Their boots were polished. They were laughing. Laughing. These were the monsters. These smiling boys who looked younger than some of her patients. A tall officer entered the ward. He removed his helmet. Sandy hair. Blue eyes. He surveyed the nurses like a farmer counting livestock. Machiko's grip tightened on the knife. Not yet. Wait for him to make his move. Then strike. The officer spoke. His Japanese was terrible. The sounds mangled beyond recognition. But then another man stepped forward. Japanese face. American uniform. Machiko felt her stomach turn. "Corporal Robert Tanaka," he said in perfect Tokyo Japanese. "I will translate for Captain Richardson." A traitor. A man with Japanese blood serving the enemy. Machiko wanted to spit at him, but she held still. "You are now prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention," Bobby translated. "You will be transported to the United States. You will receive food, housing, and medical care. No one is permitted to harm you." Keiko let out a bitter laugh. She covered her mouth immediately, but the damage was done. Captain Richardson's eyes found her. "Is something funny?" Bobby translated. Shimizu stepped forward, placing herself between Richardson and Keiko. "Forgive her. She is young. She does not understand American humor." "There is no humor here," Richardson said through Bobby. "These are facts. You will be treated according to international law." "International law," Shimizu repeated. Her voice dripped acid. "And how does international law treat women prisoners, Captain?" Richardson's face hardened. For a moment, Machiko thought he would strike Shimizu. Instead, he turned and walked out. "Prepare them for transport," he said over his shoulder. "They leave tomorrow." The ship was called USS Comfort. Machiko found that name almost unbearably ironic. A comfort ship, taking them to their doom. But then she saw the bunks. Clean white sheets. Actual mattresses. Not the straw mats she had slept on for 3 years. "It's a trick," Shimizu said, running her hand across the fabric. "They want us comfortable, so we lower our guard." A young American sailor appeared at the door carrying a tray. "Dinner." He said the word heavily accented. He set down the tray. Rice, vegetables, actual meat. More food than Machiko had seen in months. The sailor smiled and left. Hanako reached for the food immediately. Shimizu slapped her hand away. "It could be poisoned." "Then let it be poisoned," Hanako shot back. "I am tired of being hungry. I am tired of being afraid. If they want to kill us, let them kill us. At least we will die with full stomachs." She grabbed a rice ball and shoved it into her mouth. The other nurses watched, waiting. Hanako did not die. She did not even get sick. One by one, the others began to eat. Machiko was the last. She picked up a piece of fish, examined it, smelled it. It smelled delicious. Her hand was trembling. "Eat it," Keiko said quietly. "Whatever happens next, at least eat something." Machiko ate. The fish melted on her tongue. She could not remember the last time food had tasted like anything other than survival. That night, lying in her clean white bunk, Machiko pulled out her knife and stared at it. The blade caught the moonlight coming through the porthole. 3 years she had carried this knife. 3 years she had been ready to use it. But now, with a full stomach and clean sheets dying, seemed less urgent. "What are you doing?" Keiko whispered from the next bunk. "Nothing." Machiko slid the knife back into her sleeve. "Go to sleep." Fort Clayton rose from the Texas desert like a mirage. Barbed wire fences, guard towers, wooden barracks stretching in neat rows. This was it. This was where the torture would begin. The truck stopped at the main gate. Machiko braced herself, and then a woman stepped forward. American uniform, brown hair in a perfect bun. And she was smiling. "Welcome to Fort Clayton," the woman said through Bobby Tanaka. "I am Captain Elizabeth Hartwell. I know you are exhausted and frightened. I want you to understand that you are safe here." Safe. The word sounded foreign, meaningless. "You will receive 3 meals a day," Beth continued. "Medical care and personal hygiene supplies." Shimizu stepped forward. "Personal hygiene supplies. Soap, shampoo, toothpaste, hot water for bathing. For prisoners. For everyone." Shimizu's eyes narrowed. "Why?" Beth seemed surprised by the question. "Because everyone deserves basic dignity, even enemies. We were taught that American prisoners received no dignity from Japanese forces." The words hung in the air. Machiko held her breath. She had seen those camps. She knew what Shimizu was implying. But Beth's expression did not change. "I know," she said simply. And we have chosen to do things differently. September 17th. Machiko's first shower. She stood outside the bathhouse clutching a bar of ivory soap like it might explode. Keiko stood beside her, equally terrified. "What if it's gas?" Keiko whispered. "What if they lock us inside and pump in poison?" "Then we die clean," Machiko said. She did not know where the words came from. Something had shifted inside her over the past weeks. The constant kindness was wearing down her defenses. She hated it. She hated that she was starting to believe it might be real. Lieutenant Margaret Sullivan stood at the bathhouse door. Red hair, freckles, a smile that seemed genuine. "Take your time," Maggie said through Bobby. "The water is hot. There is no rush." Machiko stepped inside. Shower stalls separated by curtains. Steam rising from somewhere deeper in the building. The smell of clean. She undressed slowly. Her body was skeletal. Ribs visible. Hip bones protruding. The war had consumed her flesh and left behind only determination. She turned the red knob. Cold water hit her skin. Then warm. Then hot. Machiko gasped. 3 years. 3 years since she had felt hot water. 3 years of cold streams and rainwater, and sometimes nothing at all. She unwrapped the soap. White foam formed between her fingers. The smell hit her like a physical force. Clean, chemical, slightly floral. And suddenly, she was not in Texas anymore. She was in Tokyo. 1939. Her mother's bathroom. The wooden tub filled with steaming water. Her mother's hands massaging shampoo into her scalp. Her mother's voice humming an old song about cherry blossoms. "Machiko, you work too hard. You need to rest more." "I have entrance exams, Mother. I cannot rest." "You will make yourself sick. Promise me you will take care of yourself." "I promise." Machiko's legs gave out. She slid down the tile wall, landing hard on the shower floor. Hot water poured over her. Steam surrounded her. And she wept. Not the silent tears she had learned to hide during the war. Deep, wrenching sobs that tore from her chest like something dying. She wept for her mother, whom she might never see again. She wept for her father, who probably believed his daughter was dead. She wept for the soldiers who had died on her operating table. She wept for the prisoners she had seen starving in Manila, the ones she had walked past without helping. She wept for 3 years of fear and hunger and death. And she wept because an American woman had given her soap and hot water, and she did not understand why. 20 minutes passed, maybe longer. Machiko finally stood. Her legs were shaking. Her eyes were swollen. She caught her reflection in the steamy mirror. A stranger looked back. Gaunt, pale, but clean. Clean for the first time in 3 years. She dressed slowly and stepped outside. Keiko was waiting, her own eyes red from crying. Neither woman spoke. There was nothing to say. That night, the barracks hummed with whispered conversations. Every nurse who had bathed was trying to explain the experience to those still waiting. The water was so hot. The soap smelled like flowers. I could not stop crying. Shimizu sat apart from the others, her back against the wall, her face unreadable. Machiko approached her. "Captain, you should try the showers. The hot water is real." "I know it is real. That is what concerns me." "I do not understand." Shimizu looked up. For the first time since the surrender, Machiko saw something other than steel in her captain's eyes. She saw fear. "If they are kind to us," Shimizu said quietly, "it means we were cruel to them. If they give us soap and hot water and 3 meals a day, it means our prisoners received none of those things. And if that is true—" She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Machiko understood. The kindness was not just kindness. It was evidence. Evidence of what Japan had done. Evidence of what Machiko herself had witnessed in Manila and chosen to ignore. She returned to her bunk and lay down, the knife in her sleeve pressed against her wrist. But she did not reach for it. Not tonight. Tonight she smelled like soap. Tonight she was clean. And tomorrow she would have to face the truth about what kind of person that cleanliness had revealed her to be. Because this was only the beginning. In the weeks ahead, Machiko would learn exactly how Japanese prisoners had treated their American captives. She would read Red Cross reports with mortality rates that made her physically sick. She would discover that a red-haired prisoner she once tried to save with a single fever pill was the brother of her English teacher. And she would have to decide whether redemption was possible for someone who had watched men starve and done almost nothing to stop it. Part 2 begins with 3 words that would haunt Machiko for the rest of her life. 30% mortality. Machiko Hayashi arrived at Fort Clayton expecting torture. Instead, she received soap, 1 bar per week. Hot water 16 hours a day. Clean sheets, 3 meals. The kindness broke her faster than any weapon could have. She wept on a shower floor for 20 minutes, remembering her mother's hands washing her hair in Tokyo 6 years ago. But that breakdown was nothing compared to what came next. Because Captain Yuko Shimizu had asked the right question. If they are kind to us, it means we were cruel to them. And now Machiko was about to learn exactly how cruel. October 12, 1945. Lieutenant Margaret Sullivan walked into English class carrying a stack of documents. Her red hair caught the morning light. Her green eyes held something Machiko had never seen before. Not anger, not hatred. Something worse. Pity. "Today we will not study grammar," Maggie said through Bobby Tanaka. "Today we will study truth." She wrote 2 numbers on the chalkboard. 30%. 3%. The chalk scraped against the board like fingernails on a coffin. "These numbers," Maggie said, "represent death." She turned to face the class. 15 Japanese prisoners sat in perfect rows, backs straight, eyes forward, military discipline holding them together even as their world collapsed. 30% of Allied prisoners held by Japan died in captivity, starvation, disease, execution, torture. 3 out of every 10 men who surrendered to Japanese forces never came home. Machiko's hands gripped the edge of her desk. The wood bit into her palms. 3% of prisoners held by Germany died, and Japanese prisoners held by the United States. Maggie paused. Less than 1%. The numbers hung in the air like poison gas. Shimizu stood up. Her chair scraped against the floor. "This is propaganda. American lies designed to justify your atomic bombs, your firebombing of Tokyo, your murder of 200,000 civilians." Maggie did not flinch. "These are Red Cross reports. A neutral organization, Swiss. They inspected camps on both sides." She held up a document bearing official stamps. "This report describes conditions at Camp O'Donnell in the Philippines. After the Bataan Death March, 1,700 Americans died in the first 2 months. Dysentery, malaria, starvation. Japanese guards refused to provide medicine, refused to provide food, refused to provide water. We were at war," Shimizu said. "Resources were limited. You had resources for your own soldiers. You had resources to ship prisoners to labor camps in Japan. You simply chose not to use them on keeping prisoners alive." Shimizu's face hardened. "American prisoners were weak. They surrendered instead of fighting to the death. In Bushido, such men deserve no consideration. So they deserve to die of thirst, to be beaten for sport, to be bayoneted for trying to help fallen comrades." The room was silent. Machiko could hear her own heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. "My brother was captured at Bataan," Maggie said. Her voice cracked slightly. "Patrick Sullivan, 22 years old, red hair, freckles. He wanted to be a teacher." Machiko stopped breathing. Red hair. Patrick. Bataan. The red-haired prisoner she had seen in Manila. The one she had tried to save with a single fever pill. The one who died 2 days later. He died at Camp Cabanatuan in 1943, Maggie continued. The Red Cross report says he weighed 89 pounds when he died. He started the war at 160. Machiko's vision blurred. The room spun. She gripped her desk harder. I did not come here for revenge, Maggie said. I came here because I believe people can change. I believe nations can change. But first, you must understand what happened. You must see the truth. Only then can we move forward. After class, Machiko could not move. The other prisoners filed out. Shimizu shot her a warning glance, but said nothing. Bobby Tanaka collected the documents. Maggie erased the chalkboard. 30%. 3%. The numbers disappeared under the eraser, but remained burned into Machiko's mind. You knew him, Maggie said quietly. Not a question. A statement. Machiko looked up. Maggie stood 3 feet away. Her green eyes were wet. Patrick, you knew him. I saw your face when I said his name. Machiko's throat closed. The words would not come. I was stationed near Cabanatuan, she finally managed. In 1942, I saw prisoners. Did you see Patrick? I do not know. I saw many prisoners. They all looked... She stopped. They all looked like skeletons. They all looked like death waiting to happen. There was one, Machiko whispered. Red hair, very sick, fever. I gave him medicine, 1 pill, through the fence. I did not know his name. Maggie's breath caught. You gave him medicine? 1 pill. It was not enough. Malaria does not respond to 1 pill. He died 2 days later. I do not know if it was the same man, but the hair, the timing. Why did you help him? The question cut through everything. Why had she helped? She had been taught that prisoners were subhuman. She had been ordered to ignore them. She had risked punishment by giving that pill. I do not know, Machiko said. He looked at me. His eyes were blue, very blue, like the sky in Tokyo before the war, and I thought... She paused. I thought he looked like someone's son. Maggie sat down heavily in the nearest chair. Her hands were shaking. You risked yourself to help an enemy prisoner. 1 pill, 1 small act, and it might have been my brother. It was not enough. He still died. But you tried. Maggie looked up. Tears streamed down her freckled cheeks. In a system designed to kill compassion, you still tried. I should have done more. I should have demanded medicine. I should have protested. I should have... You were 23 years old, a junior nurse, in an army that executed people for disobedience. What could you have done? Something, anything, more than 1 pill. They sat in silence. Outside, Texas wind rattled the windows. Somewhere in the camp, a dog barked. I have hated Japanese people for 2 years, Maggie said. When I learned how Patrick died, I wanted every Japanese soldier to suffer the same way. I wanted revenge. Machiko nodded. She understood. But then I met you. I watched you learn English. I saw you help save Noriko when she tried to kill herself. And I realized something. What? The people who killed my brother were not monsters. They were humans, trapped in a monstrous system, following monstrous orders, making monstrous choices because they were told it was right. Maggie reached across the gap between them. Her hand found Machiko's, warm skin against cold. You gave my brother water when he was dying of thirst. You gave him medicine when no one else would. That matters. That matters more than you know. But not everyone at Fort Clayton shared Maggie's capacity for forgiveness. Sergeant Frank Miller had watched the Japanese prisoners receive their weekly soap rations. He had watched them bathe in hot water. He had watched them eat 3 meals a day, and every bar of soap, every warm shower, every plate of food burned like acid in his chest. October 20th. Miller cornered Machiko in the supply warehouse. She had been counting medical supplies when the door slammed shut. Miller stood between her and the exit. His eyes were red-rimmed. His breath smelled of whiskey. "Look at you," he said. "Clean, fed, healthy, living better than my brother ever did." Machiko pressed her back against the shelving unit. Her hand moved toward her sleeve. The knife was still there. "Your people starved Danny to death. They beat him. They shot him on the side of a road when he couldn't walk anymore. And now we're supposed to give you soap." He stepped closer. Too close. Machiko could see the veins in his neck, the sweat on his forehead, the grief that had calcified into rage. "How much soap did American prisoners get in your camps? How much hot water? How much food?" Machiko said nothing. There was nothing to say. She knew the answer. 0. 0. Almost 0. "That's what I thought." Miller's hand shot out. He grabbed her collar, yanked her forward. "I should kill you right now. Call it an accident. Say you attacked me. No one would question it. No one would care." "Frank." Captain Beth Hartwell's voice cut through the warehouse like a blade. She stood in the doorway. Behind her, 2 military police waited with hands on their weapons. "Let her go. Now!" Miller's grip tightened for 1 heartbeat. 2. Then he released Machiko and stepped back. His hands were shaking. "She doesn't deserve kindness. None of them do." "That's not your decision to make." Beth moved between Miller and Machiko. Her voice was ice. "One more incident and you're facing court-martial. Do you understand me, Sergeant?" Miller stared at Machiko over Beth's shoulder. The hatred in his eyes was absolute. "My brother was worth 100 of them, 1,000. And we're treating them like guests at a hotel." He turned and walked out. The door slammed behind him. Beth let out a long breath. "Are you hurt?" Machiko shook her head. But she was shaking. Not from fear, from something else. "He is right," Machiko said quietly. "We do not deserve this kindness." Beth turned to face her. "What you deserve and what we choose to give are 2 different things. Why choose kindness? Your people suffered. Your prisoners died. Why not make us suffer too?" Beth was silent for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft. "Because then, what was the point of fighting?" She guided Machiko toward the door. "We didn't fight this war to become what we were fighting against. We fought to prove there was a better way. The soap, the hot water, the food, those aren't rewards. They're declarations. Declarations that every human being deserves basic dignity, even enemies, even people who did terrible things. And if we don't deserve it, then we're proving that we deserve to be the kind of people who give it anyway." November 5th, Beth Hartwell gathered the American staff in the camp conference room. Maggie Sullivan, Rosa Gonzalez, Bobby Tanaka, Dr. Thomas Bradley, and reluctantly, Frank Miller. "The War Department wants results," Beth said. "They want to know if our approach is working. They want metrics." "What kind of metrics?" Dr. Bradley asked. "Cooperation rates, information quality, psychological assessments. They're comparing our results to interrogation-based facilities. And how do we compare? Better, significantly better. Prisoners here provide more accurate information. They're more cooperative during processing. They have fewer suicide attempts, lower rates of resistance." Miller snorted. "So we're being nice to murderers because it's efficient. We're being humane because it's right. That it's also efficient is a bonus." Beth spread documents across the table. "The War Department is sending observers next month. They want to see our methods firsthand. If we can prove this approach works, it could change how America handles prisoners in future conflicts." Maggie leaned forward. "What do you need from us?" "Stories, not just numbers. They want to understand why it works. That means documenting individual cases, progress, relationships, moments of breakthrough." She looked around the room. I'm asking each of you to identify one prisoner you've connected with. Someone whose story demonstrates what we're trying to accomplish here. Maggie's eyes found Machiko's name on the roster without being told. I have someone. Miller stood abruptly, his chair scraped against the floor. You want me to find a Japanese prisoner I've connected with? That's not going to happen. I'll do my job. I'll follow orders, but don't ask me to pretend I care about these people. He walked out. The door slammed. Again. Beth sighed. Rosa, can you work with him? Keep him from doing anything we'll all regret. Rosa nodded. I'll try. But Beth, he lost his brother. You can't order someone to stop grieving. I know. I just need him to grieve without killing anyone. November 15th. Machiko sat in English class, barely hearing Maggie's lesson about past tense verbs. Her mind kept returning to the warehouse, to Miller's hands on her collar, to the hatred in his eyes, to the truth she could no longer escape. 30%. 3 out of 10. She had watched prisoners starve and done almost nothing. 1 pill. 1 bottle of water. For 1 man who died anyway. After class, Maggie approached her desk. She was holding a photograph. Machiko recognized it immediately. Patrick Sullivan, red hair, freckles, a bright smile frozen in time. I want you to have this, Maggie said. Machiko's hands trembled as she took the photograph. I cannot accept this. I do not deserve. Stop. Maggie's voice was gentle but firm. Stop telling yourself you don't deserve things. You made a choice in that camp. A small choice. A dangerous choice. You chose compassion when everything around you demanded cruelty. That's who you are. That's who you've always been. The war just made it harder to see. Machiko stared at the photograph. Patrick's blue eyes looked back at her. The same blue eyes she had seen through the fence in Manila. The same blue eyes that had closed 2 days after she gave him that pill. He would have wanted us to be friends, Maggie said. Patrick believed in the good in people, even enemies, especially enemies. She reached out and took Machiko's hand. We can't change what happened. We can't bring him back. But we can choose what happens next. And I choose to believe that kindness is stronger than hatred. That connection is stronger than revenge. That 2 women from opposite sides of a war can find something worth building together. Machiko felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. How do you forgive me after everything? Maggie smiled. It was a sad smile, a broken smile, but it was real. I don't forgive you for what Japan did. That's too big for one person to carry. But you, the woman sitting in front of me, the woman who risked her safety to give a dying man water, I don't need to forgive you. I need to thank you. That night, Machiko lay awake in her bunk. The photograph of Patrick Sullivan was tucked under her pillow. The knife that had lived in her sleeve for 3 years sat on her nightstand. She had removed it for the first time since the surrender. She did not need it anymore, not because she was safe, not because she trusted the Americans completely, but because she had finally understood something. Death was easy. Living with the truth was hard, and she owed it to Patrick Sullivan, to all the men who had died in those camps to live, to remember, to make sure the world never forgot what had happened. Shimizu appeared beside her bunk. The captain's face was unreadable in the darkness. You are getting too close to them, Shimizu whispered. You are forgetting who we are. I am remembering who I should have been. Shimizu was silent for a long moment. Then she sat on the edge of Machiko's bed, something she had never done before. I saw the camps too, Shimizu said quietly. In Burma, in Thailand. I saw what we did to Allied prisoners building the railway. I saw men worked to death. I saw bodies stacked like firewood. I told myself it was war. I told myself they were enemies. I told myself we were following orders. Her voice cracked. I told myself so many lies. Machiko reached out in the darkness. Her hand found Shimizu's. The captain flinched but did not pull away. The Americans are not lying about the 30%, Shimizu continued. I checked. I asked questions. I found nurses who had worked in other facilities. The numbers are real. We killed 3 out of 10 prisoners in our care. 3 out of 10. We were following orders. So were the Germans. That excuse did not work at Nuremberg. It will not work for us. They sat in silence. Outside, the Texas wind howled across the desert. What do we do now? Machiko asked. I do not know, Shimizu admitted. I have been a soldier for 20 years. I have always known what to do. Follow orders, serve the emperor, die with honor. But now, the emperor has surrendered. The orders were wrong. And honor... She laughed bitterly. What honor is there in starving prisoners? The Americans think there is another way. The Americans won. Winners can afford to be generous. Or perhaps they won because they are generous. Because they built a system that produces enough to share. Because they treat even enemies as human beings. Shimizu pulled her hand away. She stood up. You sound like them now. Maybe that is not such a bad thing. December 7th, 1945, 4 years since Pearl Harbor. Beth Hartwell organized a memorial ceremony. Both prisoners and American staff attended. No accusations, no speeches about atrocities. Just a moment of silence for everyone who had died. Machiko stood between Maggie and Shimizu. 3 women. 3 different relationships to the war. 3 different kinds of grief. After the ceremony, Beth approached Machiko. The War Department observers arrive next week. They want to interview prisoners about their experience here. Would you be willing to speak with them? Machiko hesitated. What should I tell them? The truth. Whatever that means to you. The truth. Machiko thought about the shower, the soap, the hot water, the photograph of Patrick Sullivan under her pillow, the knife she no longer carried, the captain who had finally admitted the camps were wrong, the sergeant who still wanted her dead, the nurse who had become her friend. I will tell them everything, Machiko said, even the parts that make Japan look terrible, especially those parts. Beth nodded slowly. That takes courage. No. Courage would have been speaking up in 1942. This is just too late honesty. But as Machiko walked back to her barracks, she realized something had shifted. For the first time since the surrender, she felt something other than shame. She felt purpose. The war was over. But the real work was just beginning. The work of understanding what had happened. The work of making sure it never happened again. And the work of proving that 2 nations who had tried to destroy each other could find a way to rebuild. Together. Because in Part 3, the War Department observers would arrive with questions that cut deeper than any interrogation. They would want to know not just what the Americans were doing right, but what the Japanese had done wrong. And Machiko Hayashi would have to decide how much truth she was willing to tell. Even if that truth condemned her own people. Even if that truth condemned herself. Machiko Hayashi arrived at Fort Clayton expecting death. She found soap instead. 1 bar per week. Hot water 16 hours a day. 3 meals. Clean sheets. The kindness shattered her faster than any torture could have. She wept on a shower floor, remembering her mother. She learned that 30% of Allied prisoners died in Japanese camps. 3 out of 10. She discovered that the red-haired prisoner she tried to save with 1 fever pill was the brother of her English teacher. Margaret Sullivan forgave her anyway. Captain Yuko Shimizu finally admitted the camps were wrong. Sergeant Frank Miller still wanted her dead. And now, December 1945 War Department observers were arriving at Fort Clayton. They wanted to know if America's humane approach to prisoners actually worked. They wanted interviews. They wanted testimonies. They wanted the truth. Machiko had promised to tell them everything. But everything included secrets she had buried for 3 years. Secrets about what she had seen, what she had ignored, what she had failed to stop. The observers would arrive in 48 hours, and Machiko Hayashi was about to discover that speaking truth was harder than any battle she had ever witnessed. December 10, 1945, 6:00 a.m. Machiko stood at the bathroom mirror staring at her reflection. She had gained weight since arriving at Fort Clayton. Her cheeks were no longer hollow. Her eyes were no longer sunken. The skeleton was becoming human again. But inside, something else was happening. The memories she had buried were clawing their way to the surface. Manila, 1942. The prisoner compound near the field hospital. Rows of American and Filipino men crammed into spaces meant for half their number. Ribs visible through skin, eyes empty. Some lying motionless in the dirt, unclear if alive or dead. She had walked past them every day for 3 months. She had heard their cries for water. She had smelled the disease rotting through their ranks. And she had done almost nothing. 1 pill, 1 bottle of water, for 1 man who died anyway. The door opened behind her. Keiko Tanaka entered, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "You are awake early." "I could not sleep." Keiko studied her face in the mirror. "The interviews." Machiko nodded. "What will you tell them?" "The truth." "All of it." Machiko's hands gripped the edge of the sink. The porcelain was cold against her palms. "I do not know if I can." Keiko moved closer. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I saw things too, in Burma. Things I have never told anyone. Men worked to death on the railway, bodies thrown into rivers, guards who laughed while prisoners begged for water. Why did we not stop it? Because we were told it was right. Because we were afraid. Because—" Keiko paused. "Because stopping it would have meant admitting we were the monsters, and we could not face that." The bathroom fell silent. Water dripped from a faucet. Somewhere outside, American soldiers were beginning their morning routines. "The Americans will use our words against Japan," Keiko said. "They will use them to justify the bombs, the firebombing, the occupation." "I know. And you will still speak?" Machiko turned to face her. "If we do not speak, who will remember the men who died? Who will make sure it never happens again?" Keiko had no answer. December 11th, 3:00 p.m. The War Department observers arrived in 2 black sedans, 3 men in civilian suits, 1 woman in a military uniform. They carried briefcases stuffed with documents, questionnaires, and recording equipment. Captain Beth Hartwell met them at the gate. Machiko watched from the barracks window. "Colonel Harrison," Beth said, shaking hands with the lead observer. "Welcome to Fort Clayton." Colonel Harrison was tall, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man who had spent decades in military intelligence. His eyes swept across the camp with clinical precision. "Quite the operation you have here, Captain. Clean facilities, well-fed prisoners. I understand you even provide hot water for bathing." "We do." "Some people in Washington think that's a waste of resources." "Some people in Washington have never run a prisoner facility." Harrison's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Fair point. Let's see if your methods produce results." The observers spent 2 days touring the camp. They inspected the barracks. They reviewed medical records. They interviewed American staff. They took photographs, made notes, asked endless questions. And everywhere they went, Frank Miller watched. He stood at the edges of rooms. He lingered in doorways. He said nothing, but his eyes followed the observers with an intensity that made Machiko's skin crawl. On the second night, Miller cornered Bobby Tanaka outside the mess hall. "What are they going to ask the prisoners?" "Standard questions, treatment, conditions, cooperation levels." "Are they going to ask about what the Japanese did to our prisoners?" Bobby hesitated. "That's not the focus of this evaluation." "Of course it isn't." Miller's voice was bitter. "We document everything we do right. We ignore everything they did wrong, and then Washington decides we should keep being nice to murderers. Sergeant, my brother starved to death in a Japanese camp. Did you know that 89 pounds when he died? He started at 160. They worked him until his body ate itself. And now I'm supposed to smile while we give his killers soap. Bobby said nothing. There was nothing to say. Miller walked away into the darkness, but his words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. December 13th, 9:00 a.m. Interview Room B. Machiko sat across a wooden table from Colonel Harrison and Dr. Eleanor Walsh, the female observer. A recording device hummed between them. Bobby Tanaka sat to the side, ready to translate. State your name and rank for the record, Harrison said. Hayashi Machiko, Lieutenant, Imperial Japanese Army Nurse Corps. How long have you been at Fort Clayton? 3 months and 26 days. Describe your treatment here. Machiko took a breath. We receive 3 meals per day, medical care when needed, clean clothing, bathing facilities with hot water, 1 bar of soap per week, toothpaste, shampoo. How does this compare to your expectations? We expected torture, rape, execution. We were told Americans were barbarians who knew nothing of honor. And now I know we were lied to. Harrison made a note. Dr. Walsh leaned forward. Lieutenant Hayashi, we're particularly interested in your psychological state. When you arrived, what were your feelings toward your captors? Hatred, fear, contempt. And now, Machiko paused. The recorder hummed. Bobby waited. Now, I feel... She searched for the word. Shame. Harrison's pen stopped moving. Shame. We were taught that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, that prisoners forfeited their humanity, that enemies deserved no consideration. I believed these things. I acted on these things. And now I know they were wrong. Can you elaborate? The room felt smaller. The walls pressed in. Machiko's heart pounded against her ribs. This was the moment. The edge of the cliff. Once she jumped, there was no going back. I was stationed near Camp Cabanatuan in the Philippines, 1942. I saw American prisoners every day, hundreds of them, starving, diseased, dying. Her voice cracked. I did almost nothing to help them. The recording device captured every word, every breath, every pause. Tell us what you saw, Dr. Walsh said gently. And Machiko told them. She told them about the Bataan survivors arriving at the camp. Walking skeletons, cracked lips, hollow eyes. Men who had marched 65 miles with almost no food or water. Men who had watched their friends executed for falling behind. She told them about the compound. Hundreds of prisoners crammed into barracks meant for 50. No medicine, no clean water. Latrines overflowing with dysentery. The smell of death so thick it coated her tongue. She told them about the guards, the casual cruelty, the beatings for sport, the executions for minor infractions. One man shot for trying to share his rice with a sick friend. Another bayoneted for bowing incorrectly. She told them about the Japanese officers, the ones who diverted Red Cross supplies for personal use, the ones who ordered rations cut to punish escape attempts, the ones who laughed when prisoners begged for water. She told them about herself, the young nurse who walked past the compound every day, who heard the cries and kept walking, who told herself it was not her responsibility, who convinced herself that enemies were not human. I gave one man a fever pill, Machiko said. Her voice was barely audible now. Through the fence, in secret. He had red hair, blue eyes. He was dying of malaria. I knew one pill would not save him, but I gave it anyway. Because... She stopped. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Because for one moment I saw him as a person, not an enemy. A person! What happened to him? Dr. Walsh asked. He died 2 days later. I never learned his name, but I think I think he might have been Patrick Sullivan, Lieutenant Sullivan's brother. The room was silent. Harrison had stopped writing. Bobby Tanaka's face was ashen. Dr. Walsh's eyes glistened. You tried to help, Walsh said finally. One pill, one bottle of water. In a system designed to destroy compassion, you still tried. It was not enough. It was never enough. No, Harrison said. His voice was different now, softer. It wasn't enough, but it was something, and something matters. He closed his notebook. Lieutenant Hayashi, I've interviewed dozens of Japanese prisoners at facilities across the country. Most of them deny everything. They claim the reports are propaganda. They say they were just following orders. They refuse to acknowledge what happened. He looked directly at her. You are the first one who has told the truth without being forced. Why? Machiko wiped her eyes. Because the men who died in those camps deserve to be remembered. Because their families deserve to know what happened. Because... She took a shaky breath. Because if I stay silent, I become exactly what I was trained to be. And I do not want to be that person anymore. The interview lasted 4 hours. Machiko described everything she had witnessed. Every camp, every atrocity, every failure of her own. When it was over, she felt hollow, empty, like something essential had been carved out of her chest, but also lighter. The secrets she had carried for 3 years were no longer hers alone. They belonged to the record now, to history. Bobby walked her back to the barracks in silence. At the door, he finally spoke. That took courage. It took too long. I should have spoken in 1942. You were 23, a junior nurse, in an army that executed people for disobedience. That is what everyone keeps telling me. But it does not change what I saw, what I allowed. Bobby was quiet for a moment. Then, my parents were interned during the war. Manzanar. American citizens locked up because of their ancestry. They lost everything. Their home, their business, their trust in the country they had adopted. I did not know. Most people don't. America is not perfect. We locked up our own people out of fear and prejudice. But the difference is... He paused. We're trying to be better. We're trying to learn. And that starts with people like you. People willing to tell the truth, even when it hurts. He left her at the barracks door. Machiko stood alone in the Texas twilight, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The sky blazed orange and red. Beautiful. Indifferent. Inside, the other nurses were waiting. They had seen her leave for the interview. They knew what she had done. Shimizu sat on her bunk, her face unreadable. How much did you tell them? Everything. About the camps? Yes. About yourself? Yes. Shimizu was silent. Then slowly she nodded. Good. Good? The truth cannot hurt us more than the lies already have. And perhaps... She looked away. Perhaps it is time Japan faced what we did. What we became. They will use it against us. The Americans. The trials. Let them. We earned their judgment. The question now is whether we can earn something else. What? Shimizu turned back to face her, and for the first time since the surrender, Machiko saw something other than steel in her captain's eyes. She saw hope. Redemption. December 20th. The War Department observers departed with briefcases full of transcripts, recordings, and reports. Colonel Harrison shook Beth Hartwell's hand at the gate. You were right, he said. This approach works. The quality of information we gathered here exceeds anything from interrogation-based facilities. Prisoners who are treated humanely cooperate willingly. They provide accurate intelligence. They acknowledge difficult truths. Will Washington listen? Some will, some won't. But the data is undeniable. Your methods produce better results at lower cost, with fewer incidents. That's a compelling argument even for people who don't care about ethics. He glanced toward the barracks where Japanese prisoners watched through windows. Lieutenant Hayashi's testimony was particularly valuable. She described conditions in Japanese camps with more detail and honesty than any prisoner we've interviewed. That takes remarkable courage. She's a remarkable woman. Make sure she knows that. People who tell hard truths often feel they've betrayed something. She needs to understand she's done the opposite. Harrison climbed into his sedan. The engine started. The black car rolled toward the gate. Beth watched it disappear down the dusty Texas road. Behind her, footsteps approached. Maggie Sullivan. Did he say anything about Patrick? He said the testimony about Camp Cabanatuan will be included in the war crimes evidence. It may help convict some of the officers responsible. Maggie nodded slowly. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. Good. Patrick deserves justice. And Machiko? Can you forgive her for not doing more? Maggie was quiet for a long moment. The wind blew dust across the compound. The Texas sun beat down with indifferent intensity. There's nothing to forgive, she finally said. She was a young woman trapped in a monstrous system. She did what she could. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. But she tried. And now she's told the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent. She turned to face Beth. That's not someone who needs forgiveness. That's someone who needs to forgive herself. Can she? I don't know, but I'm going to help her try. That night, Machiko sat alone on the steps of Barrack 7. The Texas stars blazed overhead, millions of points of light in an infinite darkness. She thought about Patrick Sullivan dying in a camp she had walked past every day. She thought about his sister forgiving her anyway. She thought about the testimony she had given, the secrets she had finally released. She thought about Shimizu's word. Redemption. Was it possible could someone who had witnessed atrocities and done almost nothing ever be redeemed? She did not know. But she knew one thing. She was going to spend the rest of her life trying. The knife that had lived in her sleeve for 3 years was gone. She had thrown it away after the interview. She did not need it anymore. Death was easy. Redemption was hard. And hard was exactly what she deserved. But this story was not over. In Part 4, Machiko Hayashi would return to Japan. She would face a nation in ruins, a family that had mourned her as dead, and a future that seemed impossible to imagine. She would build a new life from the ashes of the old. She would become a doctor, a teacher, a writer. She would tell the story of Fort Clayton to thousands of students over 50 years. And in 1996, she would return to Texas one final time. To visit a grave, to leave a dried piece of soap on a headstone, and to say goodbye to the woman who had taught her that enemies could become friends. That kindness was stronger than hatred. That one bar of soap could change the world. The war ended in 1945. But Machiko Hayashi's real battle was just beginning. Machiko Hayashi arrived at Fort Clayton expecting torture. She found soap instead. 1 bar per week. Hot water 16 hours a day. 3 meals. Clean sheets. The kindness shattered everything she believed about Americans. She wept on a shower floor, remembering her mother. She learned that 30% of Allied prisoners died in Japanese camps. She discovered that the red-haired prisoner she tried to save was her English teacher's brother. Margaret Sullivan forgave her anyway. She testified before War Department observers, confessing everything she had witnessed and failed to stop. Captain Yuko Shimizu admitted the camps were wrong. Sergeant Frank Miller never forgave anyone. And now, March 1946, the first group of Japanese prisoners was scheduled for repatriation. Machiko Hayashi was going home. But home no longer existed. Japan lay in ruins. Her family thought she was dead, and the woman she had become no longer fit the world she had left behind. This is the final chapter of the soap that changed everything. The chapter that proves kindness echoes across generations. The chapter that most people never hear. March 17, 1946, 6:00 a.m. Machiko woke for the last time in Barrack 7. She had slept poorly. Dreams of Tokyo burning. Dreams of her mother calling her name. Dreams of a red-haired prisoner reaching through a fence. She bathed one final time with Fort Clayton's hot water. The soap was almost gone. A thin sliver remained from her last weekly ration. She used it slowly, deliberately, memorizing the sensation, the warmth of the water, the clean scent of ivory, the foam dissolving between her fingers. When she finished, she wrapped the remaining soap fragment in a piece of cloth and tucked it into her pocket. She did not know why. She only knew she could not leave it behind. Captain Beth Hartwell gathered the departing prisoners at the main gate. 37 women who had arrived expecting death. 37 women leaving with something far more complicated than survival. "You came here as enemies," Beth said through Bobby Tanaka. "You leave as something else. I do not know what to call it, but I know the world needs more of it." She shook hands with each prisoner. When she reached Machiko, she paused. "Lieutenant Hayashi, your testimony will be part of the historical record. Generations will read what you said. That took courage. It took too long. Better late than silent." Beth pressed something into Machiko's hand, a photograph. The Fort Clayton staff standing together. Beth, Maggie, Rosa, Bobby, Dr. Bradley. Even Frank Miller standing apart, his face hard. "Remember us," Beth said. "Remember what we tried to build here." Machiko bowed deeply, the Japanese bow of profound respect. When she straightened, her eyes were wet. Maggie Sullivan waited by the trucks. She was holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I wanted to give you something," Maggie said. "But everything I thought of seemed wrong, too small, too large. Nothing fit what I wanted to say." She handed Machiko the package. "So, I'm giving you this. It's not much, but it's real." Machiko unwrapped the paper. Inside was a new bar of ivory soap, untouched, still in its original wrapper. "So you remember," Maggie said. "Remember that enemies can become friends. Remember that kindness is not weakness. Remember that one bar of soap can change the world." Machiko could not speak. The tears came freely now. She embraced Maggie. Two women from opposite sides of the greatest war in history, holding each other in the Texas morning light. "Thank you," Machiko whispered. "For everything. For Patrick. For forgiving me. For teaching me that I could be something other than what I was trained to be." "You were always something other," Maggie replied. "The war just made it hard to see." They separated. Machiko climbed into the truck. The engine rumbled. The convoy rolled toward the gate. Through the canvas flap, she watched Fort Clayton grow smaller. The barracks, the bathhouse, the fence, the American flag snapping in the wind, and Maggie Sullivan, standing alone, waving, until she disappeared beyond the Texas horizon. The ship home took 3 weeks. Machiko stood on the deck as Japan came into view. She had prepared herself for destruction. She had seen photographs. She had heard stories. But nothing prepared her for the reality. Tokyo was gone. The city she remembered, the city of her childhood, the city where her mother had washed her hair in a wooden bathtub, no longer existed. In its place stood ruins, blackened buildings, empty lots where neighborhoods had been. People wandering through rubble like ghosts. The firebombing had killed over 100,000 people in a single night. March 10th, 1945. 1 year before her return. Her family's neighborhood had been in the target zone. She found her parents' house by memory alone. The streets had no signs. The landmarks had burned. But she walked the path she had walked 1,000 times as a girl. And she found it. A pile of charred timber where a home had stood. A stone garden lantern cracked but standing. A cherry tree burned, but somehow alive, tiny green buds emerging from blackened bark. She knelt in the ashes and wept. Her parents were gone. She had known it. She had felt it. But knowing and seeing were different things. A voice behind her. Machiko! She turned. A woman stood in the ruins of the neighboring lot. Old, thin, wearing clothes that had been patched 100 times. Mrs. Yamamoto. Her parents' neighbor for 30 years. Machiko! Mrs. Yamamoto said again. You are alive. Where are my parents? The old woman's face crumbled. The bombing. March. They did not make it to the shelter in time. Your father tried to save the medical records from his clinic. Your mother would not leave without him. Machiko closed her eyes. Her father, the surgeon who had served in the Russo-Japanese War, the man who had told her stories about the honor of military service. He had died trying to save paper. Her mother, the gentle woman who had washed her hair and hummed songs about cherry blossoms. She had died because she loved her husband too much to leave him. We held a funeral, Mrs. Yamamoto said. We burned incense. We said prayers. We thought you were dead too. Your name was on the casualty list. I was a prisoner. In America, Mrs. Yamamoto's eyes widened. A prisoner. They released you. They treated us well, better than we deserved. The old woman did not understand. How could she? She had lost everything to American bombs. How could she believe that the same nation had given Japanese prisoners soap and hot water? Machiko did not try to explain. Some truths were too complicated for words. She rebuilt. It was all she could do. The ruins of Tokyo became her operating room. Thousands of people needed medical care, wounded, sick, starving. The occupation government was establishing hospitals. They needed trained nurses desperately. Machiko volunteered the day after she arrived. She worked 18-hour shifts. She treated burns and infections and malnutrition. She held the hands of dying children and whispered that everything would be all right, even when she knew it would not. And slowly, painfully, she began to heal. Not from the war. That wound would never close completely. But from the silence, the secrets, the shame she had carried for so long. She told her story, first to colleagues, then to patients, then to anyone who would listen. She described Fort Clayton, the soap, the hot water, the kindness of enemies. She described what she had witnessed in the Philippines, the camps, the starvation, the casual cruelty. She described the testimony she had given, the truth she had finally spoken. Most people did not want to hear. Japan in 1946 was not ready to confront its war crimes. The nation was focused on survival, not reflection. But Machiko kept talking, because silence was complicity, and she had been complicit long enough. In 1952, she entered medical school. The occupation had opened universities to women. She graduated in 1958, one of the first female physicians in post-war Japan. She specialized in public health, sanitation, hygiene, the very things she had seen destroy so many lives in the war. She spent the next 40 years building Japan's healthcare system. She trained nurses. She established clinics. She wrote textbooks. She became Dr. Hayashi, respected, honored, sought after for her expertise. But she never forgot Fort Clayton. She never forgot the soap. The Geneva Convention of 1949 codified many of the principles that Beth Hartwell had practiced at Fort Clayton. Humane treatment of prisoners, access to medical care, adequate food and shelter, protection from violence and intimidation. The convention was signed by 196 nations. It remains the foundation of international humanitarian law. But the impact went beyond treaties. The American approach to Japanese prisoners became a model for future conflicts. In Korea, in Vietnam, in the Gulf War, in Afghanistan and Iraq. The principle was simple. Treat prisoners with dignity, not because they deserve it, because we deserve to be the kind of nation that does it. The results were measurable. Prisoners treated humanely provided better intelligence. They cooperated more willingly. They caused fewer problems. They were easier to repatriate. The soft approach that critics had mocked turned out to be more effective than torture, more efficient than cruelty, more sustainable than revenge. Fort Clayton's methods spread to other facilities, other nations, other conflicts. The soap and hot water that had broken Machiko Hayashi became standard operating procedure for civilized warfare, if such a thing could exist. But the technical legacy was not the most important one. The human legacy mattered more. Machiko Hayashi spent 50 years teaching. Thousands of students passed through her classrooms. Medical students, nursing students, public health officials. She told them all the same story. The story of Fort Clayton. The story of Maggie Sullivan. The story of one bar of soap that proved enemies could become friends. "We are taught to hate," she would say. "Hatred is easy. Hatred requires no thought, no effort, no imagination. But kindness requires courage. Kindness requires seeing the human being inside the enemy uniform. Kindness requires believing that people can change, and that is the hardest thing in the world." Her students remembered. They told their students. Who told their students? The story rippled outward across generations, across oceans, across the vast distance between those who had once been enemies. In 1985, Machiko received a letter from Texas. Maggie Sullivan was dying. Cancer. She had 6 months, perhaps less. She wanted Machiko to know that she had never regretted their friendship, never regretted the forgiveness, never regretted the soap. "You gave my brother water when he was dying of thirst," Maggie wrote. "I gave you soap when you were dying of shame. We are even now, more than even. We are sisters." Machiko flew to San Antonio. She sat by Maggie's bed in the hospital. They talked for hours, about the war, about Fort Clayton, about Patrick, about the red-haired prisoner and the single fever pill that had connected them across the Gulf of War. "I am not afraid to die," Maggie said. "I have had a good life. I have seen enemies become friends. I have seen hatred transform into love. What more could anyone ask?" She died 3 weeks later. Machiko was holding her hand. But the real legacy was not in treaties or textbooks or hospital rooms. It was in a cemetery in San Antonio, Texas, 1996, 50 years after Fort Clayton. A 77-year-old Japanese woman with silver-white hair stood before a grave. The headstone read, "Margaret Maggie Sullivan, 1917 to 1994. Lieutenant Army Nurse Corps. Compassion knows no borders." Machiko placed a cherry blossom on the grave. The flower had traveled from Japan in her luggage, a piece of home brought to foreign soil. Then she reached into her coat pocket. Inside, wrapped in silk cloth, was a small object, a piece of ivory soap, dried and hardened after 50 years. The bar Maggie had given her on the day of their farewell. She had kept it all this time, through medical school, through marriage and children and grandchildren, through the deaths of everyone she had known at Fort Clayton. She had kept it because it was proof that the world she had discovered in Texas was real, proof that enemies could become friends, proof that one small act of kindness could echo across half a century. She placed the soap on the headstone, beside the cherry blossom, beside the carved words about compassion knowing no borders. "I told the stories," she whispered. "I wrote books. I taught thousands of students. I told them about you, about Beth, about Miller, about the soap and the hot water and the kindness that broke me open so I could finally heal. I never forgot. I never stopped telling." The Texas wind blew through the cemetery, warm and dry and smelling of dust, so different from Tokyo, so different from everything she had known before the war. Her granddaughter Yuki stood a respectful distance away, a doctor herself now, continuing the legacy Machiko had built. "Grandmother, are you ready?" Machiko looked at the grave one last time. The soap gleamed in the afternoon sun. Such a small thing, Such a simple thing, but it had changed everything. One moment. She knelt slowly. Her old knees protested. She placed her palm flat on the grass covering Maggie's grave. The earth was warm from the Texas sun. "Thank you," she said, "for the soap, for the forgiveness, for teaching me that I could be someone other than what the war had made me. Thank you for Patrick, for showing me his photograph, for letting me carry his memory alongside my guilt. Thank you for believing that kindness was stronger than hatred. You were right. You were always right." She stood, wiped her eyes, turned to face her granddaughter. "Now I am ready." They walked together toward the cemetery gate, grandmother and granddaughter, two generations connected by a story that had begun with suffering and ended with healing. Behind them on the headstone, the dried soap caught the light, a small monument to an enormous truth. There is one final detail that most people do not know. In 2015, researchers discovered a box of documents in the National Archives. Declassified files from Fort Clayton. Among them was a memo from Colonel Harrison, the War Department observer, who had interviewed Machiko in December 1945. The memo was addressed to the Secretary of War. It recommended that the humane treatment approach be adopted as official policy for all prisoner facilities. But that was not the surprising part. The surprising part was a handwritten note at the bottom, added by someone in Washington, someone whose signature was illegible. The note read, "Lieutenant Hayashi's testimony is the most compelling evidence we have that our methods work. Her honesty about Japanese atrocities, combined with her gratitude for American treatment, demonstrates exactly what we hope to achieve. Recommend her file be preserved for future training purposes." Machiko Hayashi's testimony became part of the official military curriculum. For decades, American officers studying prisoner management read her words, her description of Fort Clayton, her confession of what she had witnessed, her transformation from enemy to something like friend. She never knew. She died in 2003 at the age of 84, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She never knew that her words had shaped how America treated prisoners in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. She never knew that the testimony she had given in a small room in Texas had echoed through 50 years of military history. She only knew that she had told the truth, and that the truth had set her free. From a 23-year-old nurse who kept a knife in her sleeve ready to die, rather than face American captivity, to a 77-year-old doctor placing a bar of soap on her friend's grave. Machiko Hayashi's journey proves that enemies are not born. They are made, and they can be unmade. One bar of soap at a time. The United States spent more on hygiene supplies for Japanese prisoners in 1945 than the Japanese military spent feeding American prisoners for 3 years. That investment paid dividends beyond calculation. It helped win the peace that followed the war. It established principles that protect prisoners to this day. It created friendships that spanned oceans and generations. And it taught one woman that the greatest victory is not defeating your enemy. It is transforming them into something better. Machiko Hayashi transformed. Japan transformed. The world transformed. All because someone in Texas decided that prisoners deserved soap, that enemies deserved hot water, that human beings deserved to be treated as human beings. If you know another story like this, a story of unexpected kindness, changing the course of history, share it in the comments. Because these stories matter. They remind us what we are capable of when we choose compassion over cruelty. They remind us that the soft approach is often the strongest. They remind us that one small act can echo across decades. Subscribe for more stories like this. Stories that prove history is not just battles and treaties, it is people, making choices, living with consequences, and sometimes finding redemption in the most unexpected places. Machiko Hayashi found hers in a shower in Texas, weeping under hot water, holding a bar of ivory soap, remembering her mother's hands, and discovering that the enemy she had been taught to hate was capable of something she had never imagined. Kindness. That is the power of one bar of soap. That is the story of Fort Clayton. That is why this story matters, and that is why it will never be forgotten.